Welcome to the Integral Stage. For this episode of the Metamodel series, we're happy to be joined by metamodern thinker and meta-theorist Lene Rachel Andersen. She's the author of multiple books, including Both and, The Nordic Secret, and Bildung Keep Growing. In our conversation today, we'll take a deep dive into her thinking on metamodernism, meta-theory, and her concepts of Bildung and the Bildung Rose. Lehman, is there anything you'd like to add by way of introduction before we begin?
I think it would be great if you could just say a little bit in general about Nordic Bildung to get us started, and we can move from there.
Yep. Okay. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I have written books about the future and big history and how the technological development is messing up our political and economic infrastructures and power structures in society. I've done that since 2005, and so I have been struggling with or trying to formulate this metamodernity, metamodernism paradigm for the past 20 years. I was writing and researching for 5 years before I actually published the first of my books. So, and I became an independent publisher because it was too weird for Danish publishers when I first started writing about this in 2005. And based on The Nordic Secret, which I wrote and Thomas Björkman edited, we have given this whole thing about Bildung and how to, develop societies or work on transforming societies through education and Bildung and culture and you could call it spiritual development, but you have to be careful what you mean by that. So the Nordic Secret came out in 2017, and based on that, we are a group of people here in Copenhagen who started a think tank, Nordic Bildung, because we have an infrastructure for this in the Nordic countries. It is very much geared towards, of course, what has already been proven to work and be useful, which is from the beginning, mid-19th century, the folk high schools for the rural youth, and where around 10% of Danish young farmers, both the young men and the young women, went to one of these folk high schools for 3 to 5 months, boarding school with other young people, and studied history, the latest science, the Bible, heard a lot of storytelling, a lot of discussions, sang a lot of songs, and had the whole aesthetic aspect of life included in their learning and study process. And then they learned the latest agricultural techniques so they could brew better beer and make better cheeses when they went back home and started their own farm. So it's very popular, and anybody who could afford to go would. And by the turn of the century, so 120 years ago, probably around 10% of the annual cohort in Denmark went to a folk high school. And so this was really, lifting society from the bottom through creating not just a new kind of education, but also a new kind of self-awareness, self-confidence in young people. And so they went back and became community organizers, started cooperatives, started, like prayer groups and study groups and whatever other local activities, and some of them went into politics and had a sense of self, a sense of country, a sense of responsibility, and a sense of community, and working from that background. So that has transformed Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Finland. Iceland was part of Denmark back then and did not have, actually, I don't think they had a folk high school until, a couple of years ago. But a lot of young people from Iceland, I guess, went to Denmark. So that was the historical background. Then, so this was for the 18 to 25-year-olds. And then pretty soon thereafter, actually in the 1870s, there was a new kind of boarding school started for the 14 to 18-year-olds with sort of the same program, but of course directed towards a younger age group. And the philosophy behind it was, how do we create conscientious citizens? And you can't create that, but you can, you can't force people to think in a certain way, but you can teach in a way where they start thinking for themselves and take moral responsibility for their own actions and for the communities that they're in. And if you start early, you'll probably have more success than if you start later. So that was the philosophy behind these schools. And they're still around. And I ought to know the numbers, but it's more than 10% of all young Danes who go either to one of these they're called after schools, but it's one of these schools with a 1-year program when they're between 14 and 18, and it's still around 10% who go to one of the folk high schools. And of course, today everybody grows up in a country where there's good schools, and we've got public libraries, got public service television and radio, so everybody knows that they're Danish. We don't have to teach them that. They already figured that out by themselves from the culture. So the folk high schools and the after schools are more focused on creating a strong personality in the individual. That was also part of the old program, and good citizens of the world, because they kind of know what Denmark is when they go there. And of course, today, where everybody is on the internet all the time, they also know about the world. So the content and the sort of purpose is changing slightly, but the overall purpose to create conscientious citizens out of them over the course of maybe 1 year or 6 months, 5 months is still the same thing. And of course, for them to find out what do I want to do with my life? And that's really the main purpose. And once you figure that out, you may want to be interested also in what would you want to do with your community and your society. And then, of course, we have from Sweden, they invented the study circle, and Sweden has been called a study circle democracy. I think it was Olof Palme, the former prime minister who was shot, unfortunately, 30 years ago, who called it that. So the study circle in Sweden has had a tremendous effect, and the idea behind the study circle, so I mean, you have to imagine how poor the Danes and the Swedes and the Norwegians were, and even also the Finns 150 years ago. So 1902-ish, I think his name was Oscar Olsson, came up with the idea that people in like a rural community, far away from everything, with no libraries and no money, no nothing, they just bought one book, and then one person read it and passed it on to the next. And whenever everybody had read it, they got together and discussed it, and the book went into their common library. And so they started building a library like that. And once you have people doing that across a country, something happens if they read challenging literature. And I don't know what they read, but I suppose one of the things that also happened in Sweden was that there was a group of young students, university students, who started a publishing company called Verdandi. And once per month, they gave out a little booklet the size with 130 pages on a scientific topic. And they were part of the research when I wrote the Nordic Secret. And it was like, one could be about hygiene and bacteria. One was about Greek mythology. One was about democracy. One was about the history of the United States. I mean, like really, and it was professors writing these little pamphlets. So I suppose that some of these were also what they built the study circles around. And if you have that happening among a lot of people in the rural part of the society, where people would, in other parts of Europe and in other parts of the world, still barely even learn to read and write, that creates a foundation for a lot of activities throughout society, and it empowers people. And so that is what we have been doing in the Nordic countries. And the reason why we started Nordic Bildung, and now also the European Bildung Network, is that we want to figure out what does that look like today? Because I mean, today we do know how to read and write, at least 90% of us. Unfortunately, we still have too many young people who leave school without being fully literate. But for the rest of us, what does that look like? And we're still working on that.
And that's really fascinating, and it really strikes home with me. My wife is from Nepal, and I've traveled over in India and Nepal a lot, and have seen the struggles with modernization there.
Yep.
And the difficulty of implementing democracy when there's not yet really a fully emerged sense of a national identity.
Yep.
And so this model seems like it would be really powerful to be put to use over there. I have some friends who are involved in grassroots cultivation of kind of more national and world-centric orientation. But anyway, I'm excited to hear that. And before we go too far into what could be an arcane discussion around meta theory and things like that, I'd like to get into a little bit of the personal background first. So could you say anything just about what led you into getting into metamodernism or building such arcane things as the Bildung Rose?
Yeah. So I studied business economy at the Copenhagen Business School, and I got a bachelor's degree and really could not see what I was going to use that for. So I started writing or doing what I really wanted to do, which was writing comedy for Danish television. And I also started studying theology because I'd always been, I was an atheist. No, I'm a Christian. I'm an atheist. No, whenever I went to church, it was so incredibly boring that I thought somebody had to do something about it. And eventually I was like, maybe it should be me. So I was actually considering becoming a pastor in the Danish church. And during my theology studies and writing comedy for Danish television, I went to the United States a number of times, and because I was curious about, how do you write good sitcoms? What is the craft? And so I got in touch with people in Los Angeles, and I managed to go visit some of the TV sets and see what they were doing, and read a lot of scripts there and learned a lot. And in going back and forth, I noticed something that others have noticed before me, that there are things happening in the United States that we tend to do in Europe 5 to 10 years later. And because we don't just copy everything that you do in the US in Europe, it had to be something structural. It had to be something other than just mimicking what you do. And so it got me into thinking about, so what is actually cultural evolution? What are the structures behind development? And that got me thinking about complexity. And then I tried to figure out, where do I find who writes about this? And when you start from scratch and you don't know anybody who is in this field or has ever talked about this, it's really hard to find, especially when there's no internet yet. So this was in 95, 97-ish. And the internet was there, but I wasn't really on it yet. So, it's really a different kind of world. It's like only 25 years ago. It was just like way back then, and fax machines. So I found some really good books in some of the bookstores in New York and Los Angeles. And one of them is, by the way, another really interesting thinker, Douglas Rushkoff, his Playing the Future. And that was the first sort of other source than my own head that gave me some words to put on these phenomena. And from there, I just figured out, well, culture must be evolving along the same patterns as biological evolution. And so I started reading Richard Dawkins and got into his meme theory. And what's her name? Susan Blackmore, who had written a book about the meme machine. And so I actually tried to connect the concept of memes with the structures and evolution. They already did that, but I wrote tried to develop it even more and tried to see, so what are the structures in this? And I combined it with scale-free networks and saw information as something that evolves in networks of meaning or networks of memes with some hubs and spokes. So the memes that are already the most popular will attract more memes. And so you have a network that is a scale-free network and not a random network. And so I wrote this in Danish, so only 5 million people can read it, but we'll write about it in English at some point. So I did that in the early 2000s, and that got me into then also exploring, so what was our evolution actually like? When did language evolve, and when can we prove that kind of exponential development, when did it really take off with human civilization and all the wonderful things that we have today, and the democracy and security and human rights and freedoms and all the stuff that makes life fun and meaningful and safe? When did that evolve? And one of the things that I ended up realizing is that the civilization that we have right now is completely depending on the climate that we have. And we have an 11,000 year climate period that is defining for our agriculture. And we don't know what human life looked like or can look like if that sort of climate belt or a climate phase changes drastically, because it doesn't seem like there was agriculture before we got the current climate. So there's no, it's impossible to say what it's going to look like if it changes, not just whether the climate zones are moving, but what does it actually mean to all the different biotopes that we know. I mean, they will not be able to move around. And one thing that is, for instance, telling is that humans tended to settle by the ocean. I mean, by the sea. That's where there's fish and there's variety and all kinds of animals and plants. So when the previous climate was, when climate became warmer, and that's where we are now, sea levels rose. So we actually don't know if there were civilizations under what is now water. But so we also have the story of the flood in Genesis, and there are all these myths about flooding. But so it probably has a historical backdrop. But so this, I mean, all of this, I just started reading and studying this in the late 90s, and then into 2004-5-ish when the first book came out, and then I've been working on it ever since.
So this great image of the Bildung Rose is sort of an attempt to clarify the types of study or the types of activity that would need to be integrated and balanced together in order to help people deal with the complexity of the world that's emerging. So maybe you could take us through why these categories were chosen, and what does it mean to you that power is at the center of that rose?
So, I mean, it actually started out, and it is a product of my studying the history of civilization, because I first realized that there was production and knowledge and narrative or religion. So it started out with 3 of the 7 domains: production, knowledge, religion. And it was really the centrifugal powers that, I mean, as societies grew, there were conflicts between them. They hated each other. I mean, that's why we had the Renaissance. But so once I realized that the Renaissance was really about, taking these domains apart and giving them each their own separate autonomous domain, so that religion was no longer defining science, and it was also no longer defining production. I just realized that there was something. It must have, I mean, yeah, that happened during the Renaissance, but there must have been something earlier where they also sort of separated. And then I realized, but there's something between science and knowledge. I mean, scientific knowledge, even before they invented science as a thing, there was knowledge that was factual knowledge, but it was embedded in the religion, in the narrative. I mean, once they separate it and you have science that's not embedded in narrative, but in research and in peer-reviewed a process that is the scientific process, it is science and knowledge. But that kind of knowledge was there before. It was just called something else. But between this knowledge, science, and production, there was technology. I mean, they actually do have something they collaborate about, even though they try to get away from each other. And so I started thinking, so what's the connection between religion and production? Oh, entertainment, aesthetics, music and song and dance, and palaces and all that stuff. So it started out as being called aesthetic entertainment, then art, and then I figured out, okay, so the overall concept here is aesthetics, beauty. And then once I had the technology and the beauty and their aesthetics, it was like, so what's the common denominator between science and religion? And it was ethics. It's not the same ethics. In science, it's a method, ethics that you have to apply to your science, otherwise it's not science. And in religion, you have moral values, and aesthetics or ethics is the principles behind those moral values. And so it was a long process. And the first time that I described it was in 2007, and then it's still I'm still working with it. And I mean, perhaps shouldn't say this, but pure coincidence that the narrative and ethics are at the bottom and work as the foundation for the whole thing. So the spiritual meaning making, the emotional depth in storytelling is down there. So that is the moral question: what ought to be? And then the middle layer is the science and the aesthetics. So that is what could possibly be, and also the political power in the middle. And then the top is what's possible here and now. What can we do? It's like more stuff. And so there is a balance in this. And it wasn't me being a clever architect. It just, if I had turned it like 30 degrees in one direction, it would have been a mess. But I didn't. So. But it's very, I mean, it's a prism, and it's a way of, sort of checking the boxes. Okay, I mean, if we're discussing society, if I'm planning my education, if I'm trying to understand the world, do I actually understand all these 7 domains in society, or am I completely lost with regards to science, or have I completely ignored the cultural history, the narratives, the explanations of why the world is the way it is, and do I understand where we're coming from? Because if I don't, then this world can be a very confusing place. And I think if you design education, if you design schools or programs, it would be a good idea to make sure that you have, cover all 7 domains, even if it's a science program or an art school or a philosophy course. You have to have all of it in there. Or, I mean, new accountants, new business economists, they're the worst. They should definitely study all of these domains. So, yeah.
Yeah, I was looking at the kind of the fractal way that you deployed the Bildung Rose and some of the dynamics of how you talked about the interrelationships among the elements of there. And it reminded me of the Native American medicine wheel. Are you familiar with that as a paradigm?
No, and it's funny because there was somebody I talked to the other day who was mentioning, oh, what was that? Yeah, but no, I'm not. But people see parallels to other models, and I really love that. So yeah, no, I don't know that.
It's a holotropic kind of paradigm. It's a tool for orienting towards wholeness. It basically orients you towards the cardinal directions, but then also elements of the landscape, also kind of elemental powers of nature, but then also all of the powers of the human being and of the society. So north is not only the wind, but it's also mind, it's also wisdom. East is not only the sun, it's also values and spirit and like that. So they have different elements at different scales that are associated with the wheel. And it's used to orient you towards all of those domains. And in the center is power. It's the locus of control. It's where,
right.
And so the idea is to find a balance within that overall wheel and orient yourself from the center of it with an internal locus of control so that you actually are able to move in the world as a beautiful human being, as a complete unfolded flower of a human being. Right. So for me, there's a nice parallel there in terms of, I think, some of the basic strategies of working with the dimensions of human life and orienting towards wholeness. And just thinking about the different scales, you kind of pulled out these fundamental domains of society. And how do you see, if there is a way that you can do a kind of translation, each of these domains possibly also relating at the individual level to different human dimensions, human capacities?
Yeah, I mean, so it is a model of society, but then of course, if you are to thrive in that society, your inner world has to somehow match that, or be able to, do critical thinking towards all of them or some of them. And the political power in the center, in the societal version of the model, of course, in the individual is the sense of self, the self-control, the self awareness, and your emotional freedom to act the way that you want to do, and not be manipulated by either your desires or other people or commercials or anything like that. And if you look at it as a model of the inner world of the person, I would like to make it horizontal and say that you can expand your knowledge in all these directions, and you can expand your horizons. So it becomes a plane, a landscape where you can explore more and more in all directions. And then the center becomes a vertical axis where you have emotional depth, and you can have higher and higher moral aspirations, or bigger and bigger ambitions on behalf of yourself and others. So, and then you can become this rounded personality who knows more and more about the world, but who's also deeper and deeper connected to self and others and culture and tons of stuff, and want more and more, do more and more. And then it's also easy to illustrate that there's a difference between being a rounded 11-year-old or a rounded 40-year-old or a rounded 80-year-old. And on that note, I'm very pleased that the United States will have a 78-year-old president very soon. Not that the 73-year-old was doing a lot better due to his age, but I think that we shouldn't just see it as a problem that somebody with that much power has such a high age, because wisdom comes with life experience. And I think that right now it will serve all of us very, very well. So so at the individual level, you can also use this model. And of course, you can also use it as I hate the word tool, but as a sort of a way of exploring. What do I think is interesting and fun? And so where is it that I, immediately know what I want to do? And I can just, lose myself, and the whole weekend is suddenly gone, and I've been, deep diving into, can be technology, it can be the arts, can be, religious experience or something. And if I do that, what is it that I'm missing? And what is it that does not allow me to communicate with the same kind of depth with people who have different interests? And why is it that I don't find that equally interesting? Why do I hate science, for instance? Or why do I hate the business and market and production and all that pragmatic stuff? Can I find something in myself that allows me to show the same interest in that as that for which I'm really, already all, fired up? So, so you can use it as a sort of self-analysis kind of tool.
A lot of people who make big picture models like this in metamodern or integral senses of a big space that includes all these different kinds of domains trying to be interactive with each other, focus on traditional, modern, and postmodern sets of perspectives and values. What do you think that a big picture model loses if it doesn't emphasize indigenous perspectives along with those other three?
I would just like to, describe all four of them just briefly. Indigenous is the hunter-gatherer and early agriculture Stone Age, and pre-modern is Bronze Age and Iron Age. And so we're talking the first city-states with 5,000, 10,000 people, 100,000 people in many of the axial age ring-walled city-states, and Rome had like 1 million people around year one. And then the modern era, let's say it begins with Gutenberg's printing press, and then the postmodern era, the past 50 years. The indigenous, the prehistoric indigenous phase was 200,000 years. Our brains grew out of that, and we thrive in little tribes of 30 people, 148, the Dunbar number is what we can handle, and personally relate to people. Some can do a little more, some a little less, but that is what nature created. That is who we are. And it's deeply meaningful to just sit around a bonfire and share food and stories. And if we don't have something resembling that, if we don't have that kind of tribe, if we don't have that kind of close relationships, that is really part of our, it really is part of our DNA, then there's something missing. And we're going to go looking for stimulants that are going to give us that, and then we're going to gather around something else. Family meals are sort of a substitute for this, but if we can't have that kind of family meals and those, tight-knit connections with people around the bonfire or something that resembles it, we're going to be miserable. And we need a sense of place, and we need the feeling of, grass or soil under our feet from time to time. You need to feel the wind against your face. I mean, now we're spending our time on Zoom right now because of the coronavirus, and we're just going nuts. And if you're not going nuts, you're probably, miserable in some other ways, because we need to be around human beings, and we need to feel that we're human beings. And there's something, growing your own food and harvesting your own food and making your own meals is, and particularly if you do it together, is touching something very, very deep inside us, and it's beyond language. And then there, of course, there's the whole, the cult and the ability to go on some sort of, not necessarily a spiritual dream trip of sorts like a shaman, but where you are allowed to, let down all your guards and just be, completely open to the people around you, the way that you are in a small tribe. So it's a crucial part of being human. And then we have the pre-modern elements from the greater societies, which is, the main things that we still practice from that would be what we now call religion, which is a spiritual narrative that tells us what is right and wrong, and has a tradition of aesthetics that go along with it, symbolic acts, rituals, and we're also a ritualistic species. So we need to do rituals together. And if we don't have rituals that are religious, we're creating other rituals. It can be the way that you enter your home after you come home from work. It can be watching the news every night at the same time. We do create these cycles of rituals if we don't have them otherwise. And so if we don't have the religious rituals that carry with them the narratives and the grand stories where generations before us have struggled with existential questions and deep moral questions, we're just going to spend that energy on something that is more superficial and doesn't have, carry with it the same load of experience. And then, of course, from the modern world, we need democracy, human rights, equal rights, science, the, reason, doubt, checking for facts. And then from the postmodern world, we need the ability to see things from multiple perspectives, and we need to be aware that a huge part of everything that we know as culture is a social construct, and we need to be able to see what is a social construct and what is not a social construct, and which of these social constructs do we need to deconstruct, and which ones do we need to just leave the way they are because they have a quality the way that they are. And then, of course, the big question becomes, so what do we bring with us into the future from the indigenous lifestyle, prehistoric indigenous lifestyle, from the pre-modern world, from the modern world, and from the postmodern world? And what I have worked myself to realize is that it's very much depending on what group size we're dealing with. So the power structure of the indigenous tribe does not work in a 3 million strong country. You can't just have one family ruling 340 million people. That's corruption. On the other hand, if you take the legal structures of a modern nation state and apply them on family relations, it's just going to tear the family apart. If you have like child abuse or something else that's really harmful, then you need, of course, the state and courts and police and stuff to go in and intervene and make sure it stops. But you can't have a written document about the house rules in a family. It's not going to be a family anymore if you do that. So we need to be aware of what kind of group size are we dealing with, what would be the proper power structure. And once we know the group size and the sort of level of intimacy that we can have in this group, what kind of power structure would be appropriate and what would not work, because we can have, you know, the right stuff applied in the wrong place and it'll be horrible.
I have two questions competing in my mind, and I don't know which one to ask.
Bring him up. I will do my best.
We'll find our time. I think probably I wanted to first say something. I talked about an indigenous framing with the medicine wheel, and now I'm wanting to bring in maybe a classical level comparison, which is a word I've seen written and I've never heard pronounced, so I might not do it correctly, but it's the Greek notion of antikoluthia, which basically means the mutual entailment or the reciprocal implication of the virtues, and that any virtue by itself actually doesn't function like a virtue unless it's balanced by some of the others. Bravery without discernment or temperance is recklessness and it's destructive. Right. So there needs to be a balancing among the different virtues. And I noticed you exploring that kind of dynamic with the Bildung Rose in terms of the different domains. And if there's an overemphasis in one direction or another, you result in different kinds of states of disharmony or dysfunction. So I wanted to know if you could say anything about that, and if that could possibly be used as a kind of practice. Yeah.
So, I mean, the last thing, I didn't know that Greek word, and I wouldn't be able to repeat it. So, but I absolutely, it's so wonderful. I mean, these Greek, they were so clever. It's amazing. There's so much stuff in this, 2,000-3,000 year old sources, and it's just amazing what they came up with, and in other civilizations too. But with regards to the imbalance in the Bildung Rose, I mean, right now we have a culture in the West where the economy dictates everything. There's barely, I mean, I'm almost saying thank God for Corona, because it proved that suddenly politics can actually overrule the market. I knew that all along, but politicians were not, it was like, oh, we'll just sell it off, or we'll privatize this, or the market will take care of it. And if it doesn't work in the market, we don't want it. It's just, so the market is dictating everything in politics, and really politics in the center of society, or the Bildung Rose, really ought to make sure that all these domains are balanced. But now we have a culture where the creation of more money is dictating everything. And so the production used to be where money was, generated, and capitalism is about people investing the little money or much money they have in order to gain more money. And so the whole point in capitalism, that's the difference between market economy and capitalism, by the way. So market economy is that you produce something, you take it to the market in order to get money to buy more stuff and take it home. And capitalism is the other way around. It's like, ooh, I got capital. I'm going to invest it in something so we can produce something so I can get more money. And that is how we've organized our societies, our economy, our societies, and what is dictating politics. And that's just, I mean, that's really poverty in the worst sense of the word. So we have set up a system where everything is about making more money in the system. Unfortunately, it stays at the top of the economy among the people who have the most money already. And there's a limit to how much money can be, for some reason, generated in the real economy. So now technology is making new currencies in order to make more money. And it's a parallel economy, and we're creating this. And I haven't even thought this through, but I mean, from a philosophical perspective, it's really interesting that we're now flooding the world with what we call cash. And we don't even have to produce the cash. It's just ones and zeros in a, kind of sealed off reality, which is cyberspace. And somehow that connects with the real world and everything in the Bildung Rose. And so we have these two, production and technology, at the top of the Bildung Rose, that are just generating more and more and more and more and more cash. And we don't have the will to tax all that nice cash and bring it down into the rest of the Bildung Rose, which is a problem, because it's a very small percentage, or a percentage of people in the economy who keep all that cash that is being generated. And then we have scientists and political institutions, democratic institutions, courts, judges, police, school teachers, libraries, got artists, and then we got the whole religious spectrum. I know there are some televangelists who have figured out how to make a lot of money, but other than that, there's an imbalance in our civilization where all the money is staying at the top of the Bildung Rose. Another imbalance would be like a theocracy, like Iran or Saudi Arabia, where the religion is defining everything. So it's the domain of the narrative, and it's just shutting everything else down. And it is sort of allowing a bit of technological development and production because they do need money. But they're not allowing science to be science. They're not allowing the arts to develop as the arts, and they're not discussing ethics outside of the narrative. And so their religion is tearing society apart because there's an imbalance. And what would you call China? I guess that's they're making the same mistake as we are, but from a totalitarian, authoritarian political systems perspective, not from a democratic one, but we're equally occupied with money and increased production, and that's not going to work long term, and is already creating more problems than it's solving.
Once you started to get busy working on formulating ideas at this scale of comprehensiveness, you end up coming into conversational communities with other people who are also trying to work in that general terrain. Has it been your experience that there's a difference between male and female attempts to make big pictures, or not so much?
I would say I run into more men in this field than I run into women. This is not politically correct, but I think it's actually a fair representation of the world. I think there are more men who are occupied with all these abstractions than there are women, and you simply, we have more male nerds than there are women, and so evolution has created us along the bell curve, and the men are towards the extremes. Nature experiments with the males, so there are more male men who fall out of the bottom of society than there are women, and there are more men at the top level of really advanced science, art, music, power structures, everything. And there's a competition among men that works in a radically different way among women. And men, and I've experienced this a couple of times, which is and this conversation is a great pleasure, I have to say, but I have been in other conversations with two men where they hadn't figured out who was the alpha male. And until that dynamic had been settled, I could just shut up because it would have been impossible for me to, contribute a single word to that conversation. So there is a struggle between men finding out what is the hierarchy, who's on top, who gets to decide, and then we can open the discussion for everybody. It's a different dynamics than among women. So it's very interesting. Then there's a different kind of pecking order among women, and I haven't figured it out. It's so much easier with men. So yes, there are some differences, but of course, there are men who are more towards the sort of female social structure, competition kind of conversation, and of course women who are more towards the competitive, geeky, intellectual, nerdy kind of male competition field. And I think we should be honest about that, and that also makes it easier to open it up and be aware of, so who is it we're not seeing in this conversation, because it tends to be extremely competitive, nasty, and a struggle for ending on top of the conversation rather than everybody actually learning something from the conversation and then, creating some meaningful results out of this rather than figuring out who's the smartest person in the room. So yeah, and I also think that, I think that we are failing a lot of men in our society, and that's a huge problem. And I'm really worried about that, because the men who cannot compete and who do not make a lot of money and who do not acquire all this status that goes into being attractive to women are really losers in the current society, and that is extremely dangerous. And it's also, I mean, it's bad for the men, and I feel sorry for them, seriously. And we ought to do, I mean, we ought to be better as societies, and that this is a political choice, and it's really horrible. And men, there are different expectations towards men than towards women, and it's really, really hard for a woman to become an extreme loser in the system, because women are better at keeping their friendships, and they can be, we don't expect culturally women to be providers the same way that we expect from men. And so women on social welfare, single mothers that they, with children they cannot support through their own work, we do not look down upon them the same way as we would look down upon a man who cannot provide for himself in the economy. And so the men suffer from a level of shame and ridicule in a way that the women in a similar situation would not do. And we are, as we are losing all the unskilled jobs, it is harder on the men than on the women.
Benita Roy has complained about two things that are a little bit related to gender. And one of them is that a lot of women, in her view, who should be considered metamodern thinkers, have been sort of dismissed as being feminist thinkers over the years. And the other one is that the preponderance of the masculine style has led to a linear developmental notion with an emphasis on tactics and a tendency to replicate the underlying metaphysics of modernity, even as we're attempting to go beyond it and getting us into a kind of trap where we try to solve it by using its own tools. Is that something you resonate with?
Yeah, I'm not going to give any examples. I could get into trouble, but yes, I can see that happening in certain debate for us. Yeah. So I think that, and it's, I mean, it's wonderful if some of those guys are watching. It's like, we're talking about you. No, but it's, and on the other hand, I'm really frustrated that there are not more women who are interested in all of these big issues, because it really is male dominated. And I mean, the women are going to be left behind again. And one, I mean, there's this discussion, then there's one more thing. There are like two big issues where women are not, you know, keeping up the, you know, power that we fought for and that we got in the democratic nation states with the voting rights. The other one is the digital infrastructure and the technological development, which is not only male dominated and to, I mean, such a huge extent defined by men, but is also very young men. And so the wisdom and maturity that some men actually do acquire, luckily a lot of you, is not necessarily represented in the technological development. And we're not just talking about railroads or water pipes. I mean, we're talking about artificial intelligence and software and infrastructure that is going to make its own decisions about who can do what in that infrastructure. And that is designed by predominantly men between the age of, what do I know, 18 to 40 or something like that. A lot of good things to be said about men between the age of 18 to 40, but it might not be good for, you know, the broader picture and the bigger issues in society, that they get to define what the digital infrastructure is going to look like, because we're all going to be using that. And so, I mean, it's really, really too bad that there are so few women in these discussions. And it's really hard. I mean, when I post things on Twitter, Facebook, or anywhere else about these issues, I have men who like and disagree and comment and click, and like one woman. It's not the same woman every time. It's like one woman and 20 men. And it's so frustrating. And I mean, I can't blame the men for this, but I can definitely blame the women. And we're gonna be the losers in that regard. But it's not just going to be us. I think it's going to be all of society, and it's going to be all of civilization.
This is a small scale example, but in just doing this over the past year, in a few months for this YouTube channel, we've been continually frustrated by the lack of women's interest in participating. We regularly invite women to participate and to come talk. And there are definitely many women that we recognize as having something important to say. And often they back out or they decline, and not certain why. Maybe in part they're afraid of entering a too masculine dynamic where they might not be able to share meaning in the way that they would like to. Or I'm not certain about that, but we've definitely, been a little bit frustrated by that and hoping to have a fuller representation of women's vision and thinking on these topics. I think it's really important. Helena Norberg Hodge, just thinking about what you were talking about with some of the younger males kind of getting to set the terms for society. She remarks that men between 18 and 22 are the weak links of every society. And at one level that they're actually very dynamic and creative and they do a lot, but there's a kind of a narrow focus that if the whole culture orients around pleasing that demographic, it misses a lot. It leads to a definite recognizable imbalance. And she was finding that living in Ladakh, where she saw modern culture entering into Ladakh, and a lot of the focus was around actually things that satisfied men 18 to 22 in terms of the media and the technologies and all of those things that were entering the society without much ability to interface with the already established traditional wisdom structures that were there. So yeah, just that was a little commentary resonating with what you were talking about. The other question that was competing in my mind before was related to the idea of metamodern religion. And I was struck by something you said in a conversation where you mentioned that spirituality is something that can happen where you can see eye to eye, where you can maintain that personal contact and practice together. And that when you enter into larger scales of meaning making, you need something like religion in order to, organize the space and empower, the group. And so I'm struck by that observation. And I wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts on what is religion at the level of metamodernity? And for you, is there anything like a religious impulse in meta-level thinking or metasystemic vision? I want to qualify that because the last person I kind of asked something like that to, they thought I meant, should our meta theories be religious? And I don't mean that. I mean, is there an implicit religious dynamic to seeing the world in that way and attempting to work at that level in the world?
Well, I think some people are good at math and some people just cannot, wrap their mind around it. And some people have a spiritual inclination and other people are just, don't have a clue what we're talking about. And some of us have spent a lot of thinking and struggle to either find God or reject God. So, this is an emotional realm where we're different. But I think if we look at the species as a whole, our reason emerged out of a species that started out being spiritual. And if we go back to before there were human beings and before there was language, how would you distinguish between what was dream and what was reality if you could not coordinate your thinking and experiences with the other people in the tribe or the other apes in the tribe? So it has taken hundreds of thousands of years to get to the point where we say, okay, the three of us all experienced, I hope so, all experienced being on this Zoom call. The experience that I had where I was suddenly flying and turning around 180 degrees and then, taking one more spin and landing on my chair, that was a dream I had. You did not see that happening. So we can coordinate that among ourselves. But if we don't have language, how do I know what was my real experience and what was a dream? And so until these two experiences, the dream and the reality, can be equally strong, and dreams can seem real. And so that is the kind of reality that our minds and our civilization, culture, human life emerged from. And so it's taken a lot of time to distinguish these from each other and create language around it. And so there's, the going in and out of different stages or phases of consciousness is part of the human experience. And in prehistoric indigenous culture, and also in current indigenous cultures from around the globe, it is still there. And we know it as animism or other kinds of, shamanism or something else. And then we have religion emerging in these big societies. And I think, and this is my hypothesis, the reason is that as long as you live in small communities, you can read body language and you can have eye contact. And so you can sense whether other people are, aligned with your thinking or with what is going on. But once you have 2,000 people in the same city, you can't all go to the same shaman and have, conversations about the other worlds that you're traveling in and out of. And you can't have people on their own or in little groups going in and out of reality. You have to coordinate it, and you have to do it everybody on Friday afternoon or everybody on Sunday morning. Otherwise, this won't work. And it's not like anybody came up with a plan for this. It just happened to be so that the ring-walled cities, the societies who managed to come up with the rituals and narratives that produced this kind of coordination survived well. And so there is a Darwinistic competition among narrative producing, ritual producing societies, where the ones that managed to, coordinate the most people were the ones that survived well. And the narratives and rituals and communities that did not manage to coordinate people in that way did not survive well. And they didn't call it religion back then. They called it serving God or, offering to Shiva or, something like that. And it was part of politics. It was so, if you look at the Bildung Rose, if we go back 3,000 years, power and production and science, the knowledge and narrative and the beauty and the ethics, and for that matter, the technology, was like all, tangled together. And so the process of civilization has been to untangle them from one another. And we can take a story like Joseph in the court of Pharaoh. What does he do? He interprets, he ends up in prison, so he interprets a dream. So he's sort of a shaman. And then he becomes the head of production in the court of Pharaoh. So, he becomes a high priest and part of the political power because he has knowledge that nobody else has. I don't know if he actually did that. It's a good story, but he may not have been able to look 14 years into the future. But then he becomes the master of the tax authorities. And so he's in production. And that just shows how this was all, mixed together until we separated them. And today, with a modern open society and rule of law, we don't want the religious stories to define what our taxes should be or what science should be like. And if science tries to design new narratives, they tend to really suck. So it's really hard to, take the one domain and try to impose it on the other domains. They have to specialize and then communicate and collaborate with the other domains, but in mutual respect.
When you were describing Bildung culture, there was like a recurring theme of simple practices in terms of, folk development and schooling. It's very, very natural, very human way to go about things. But when you were describing your personal story, and I think this is true for a lot of people that do thinking in this area, the role of developmental complexity is a huge piece of making sense of this space of types of perspectives. So how do you think about the relationship between simplicity and complexity?
So is that, I mean, a question about how I practice metamodernity myself?
Sure, it could be, but also two things. One is like, how does it work for you?
Yeah.
The other one is how do simplicity and complexity modulate each other? Because more complexity just on its own can become something we can't really handle. It has to be simplified for us.
Right.
But then too simplistic and it can't actually handle that complexity. So how do you think about their relationship and about how simplicity and complexity need to work together?
As at the intellectual level, where I understand the world and describe the world, I need to be able to grasp the complexity. But in my own personal life, I don't have to have everything. I need to make choices. And of course, if I'm heading some kind of organization or if I'm in political power, my personal choices have consequences for a lot of people. So I have to make, decisions based on a bigger perspective. And I can't just, make decisions that I'm happy about. Other people have to be happy about them as well. But if I look at my own personal life, I mean, I was never happier. I mean, I have been, but I was really happy when I lived with my boyfriend in an apartment where we had a huge balcony and I could grow tomatoes. I mean, it's the first time I've had my own little vegetable garden, and it was so meaningful. I was so happy because, and I know that gardening is used as therapy, because there's something happening to you when you're dealing with nature, and it just takes the time that it takes, and you can't force it, but you can just plant a seed and then look at it in wonder and see how that becomes a plant. I actually have some really amazing basil in my windowsill at home right now. I don't have a balcony, but the basil it's still alive. Very incredible. But it makes me happy. It's a stupid plant, but it makes me happy every time I enter my living room that I have this. It's like most of the basils are this tall, and this one is like huge. I don't know what happened to it. It's a mutant of sorts, but it makes me happy that I have these plants in my apartment and I can eat them, and that is a choice. If I'd had a house, I would probably light a bonfire from time to time in the garden and just sit out there and, I don't know, fry bread or something. So it's, you make your choices depending on where you are and what your resources and opportunities are, what's actually possible where you are. But I think the awareness of this, and it's also about, so, I mean, how do you host dinner parties, and how often? Right now we can't, but normally it's important that you gather people around a meal, and meals are significant. You can't just, have, half the family eating at one point and then everybody else getting what they want from the fridge on their own. At least once per week, and preferably once per day, everybody ought to sit down and actually have a meal and have a conversation around the meal and the storytelling, because that's how you connect with your family. So, I mean, there are all these elements of being human that we have told ourselves are not necessary because it's not convenient, and we are suffering, and we have, depression, anxiety. We have all these people who are angry and confused, and it's just we're not serving ourselves. We're mistreating nature, but we're also mistreating ourselves, and we are nature, and we grew out of nature, and religion grew out of that as part of the process. But that doesn't mean that religion doesn't have anything of value. It just means that with the knowledge that we have today, we have to relate to it and practice it with a different kind of knowledge than people would have done 300 years ago.
When I asked you about the religious impulse behind meta-theorizing or metasystemic thinking, I was thinking in part of the meaning of religion, which is relegere, I think, to retie, to rebind. And there's this idea, that the value spheres have differentiated. You've been describing that, how over time the value spheres differentiated. At first they were like kind of soup. We're swimming in that, and there's been a gradual differentiation. And now there's a movement towards reintegrating, resynthesizing, reharmonizing those domains so that they don't fly off too far into different states of dissociation and the different kinds of imbalances and disharmonies that can arise from that. And I think that's related, in my understanding, I've only been exposed to your work in the last few weeks, but I've been trying to really get a good sense for it. But in your understanding of Bildung with its early, religious origins and the kind of the internal process of development that happened. So for the people who are listening to this video who maybe haven't heard much elsewhere, could you say a little bit more just to flesh out this concept of Bildung and that movement?
Yeah, so Bildung comes from the German word Bild, which means an image. And in the 1600s, in the Protestant Europe, there was pietism, and the pietists were also the ones who immigrated to America. And they had this, until then, Christianity was like water to the fish. It was just the culture, and the concept of personal faith was really not in focus, if at all. It was just the way that society was. And then you had the Reformation, and it was suddenly like, oh, so it isn't just all defined. There isn't just one true way of Christianity, or actually they thought there was, but it's like, we have to figure out what is the true kind of Christianity. And it's all not just all, the Pope isn't just, all knowing and fast track the internet connection to God. It's like we were struggling with this, and with Protestantism there were suddenly all these sects and different approaches. And one of the things that emerged from that was this sense of the personal metanoia, turning around of the soul, the conversion from just living religion the way everybody did to actually feeling the spirit and the connection to Christ, and then molding yourself in the image of Christ and creating yourself in the image of Christ. And so that was Bildung. And until 1740s, 50s, the word Bildung in German literature and poetry and philosophy, theology, was a Christian understanding of Bildung, referring to this. And then because of the Enlightenment, it kind of disappears. And there's actually a PhD student in 1931 who wrote a thesis about this, and she's been counting how many times the word Bildung was used by different authors. I don't know how long time that took her, and I never found the original PhD dissertation, but I found a print of part of it. And so she drew a graph showing how different authors were using it the fewer and fewer times per year. And then it kind of, almost nobody uses the word Bildung when we get to 1750. But then by 1762, somebody starts using the word in a secular sense, where the Bild, the image, is the image of all that, that you contain, that you can create, that is uniquely you. And so Bildung becomes this personal, moral and emotional development, and you're maturing over the course of your life. And one of the first authors to write about Bildung in this sense, and really doing it sort of thought through and systematically, is the German philosopher Herder. And he writes about the story or history about the Bildung of mankind. And what he does is that he compares the development of Bildung in civilization societies to the personal Bildung of the individual through life. And what's really interesting is that the way that he describes a toddler, a young child, a little older child, a young man, and then the wise man, is how we would describe people today. It's different context, but the way that a 7-year-old is described, I can absolutely see that in a modern 7-year-old. And the way that a 18-year-old, man, we're talking about the hero and the manly man before, same thing. But then, of course, when he gets to describing the civilizations, it becomes incredibly politically incorrect, because he describes the Middle Eastern nomadic tribes as the toddler. And then he has what would that be, the Phoenicians, I think, as the young child, and then the Greek as the a little older child, and the Romans as the young man, and then the Catholics as the sort of young adults, and then the Protestant, and he was a Protestant himself, so of course they were the most gebildet people with the most maturity. They would be like the mature adults. And I mean, I've done something similar in my early books in Danish, because there is what we're capable of thinking and expressing in any language or culture, of course, evolves over time. And the more complex the culture, the more we become aware of, the more we know, and the more tolerant, hopefully, and the deeper the thought structures in that culture can be. And we can only, as individual, think in terms as complex as the culture provides us with language and epistemology. Except those of us who then spend time on Zoom discussing these matters, trying to just push the boundaries a little bit there, a little bit there, a little bit there, and somebody comes up with a new word or brings in a Greek word that nobody can pronounce. And it's like, oh, now we have a word for this thing. It's like, this is where we were thinking before, but now up here I can put a word here. We can go up here and explore it. But I mean, we could not have had this conversation 200 years ago, because we're using so many words and concepts that they didn't have. But their emotional development was just as advanced as ours. And one of the things that I learned from studying this Bildung stuff is that the philosophy and understanding of the human psyche that went into creating our educational systems around 1800, not just in Europe, but also in the United States. And later you had a philosopher like Dewey, early 1900s, around the turn of that century. They were not dumber than we are today. I mean, they were actually really smart and really understood the human psyche. But of course, the references were different. And I would say they were very ambitious on behalf of their educational systems. And they had an insight and an understanding of, we need to educate people better than we're used to. And so for the German Bildung thinkers, and so Herder was the first one, then Goethe contributed, so did Schiller, and then Fichte and Schelling and Hegel, and then von Humboldt was designing the universities in Prussia from around 1810. And there were people in the UK and the United States who were part of that movement. But the German thinkers were focusing on the bourgeoisie. And they were just thinking about their own estate. I mean, we also have to understand that these were feudal societies where you had the royals, and then you had the clergy, and then you had the aristocrats, and then you had the third estate. And the middle class, the bourgeoisie, didn't really fit into that layered society. And so they were the ones who actually created the liberal society that we enjoy today by sort of pushing away the other boundaries and integrating all the other classes into the middle class. But back then, I mean, the Bildung thinkers were of the bourgeoisie in that layer, and they were just thinking about this for themselves, because who cared about the peasants? And they were actually corresponding with, meeting with aristocrats, which was like a breakdown of the barrier between those two classes. It was like outrageous. But they were also struggling against, of course, the clergy, and then they wanted political freedom, so no more royal heads of state. But they were thinking of Bildung as a thing for the bourgeoisie and the sons of the bourgeoisie. What happened in Denmark was that there was a pastor who started out by thinking that the sons of the Danish bourgeoisie who went to high school and studied Latin and Greek in order to become good bureaucrats and civil servants in the Danish government and become, veterinarians and doctors and all that stuff, instead of studying just Greek and Latin and the Greek and Roman mythology, they should learn Danish much better, because they were going to rule Denmark not Greece or Rome. So they needed to have a rich and full Danish language to communicate with their countrymen and women, and they needed to understand the historical and mythological roots of the Danish culture. And so he first thought of this Bildung, folk Bildung, Danish Bildung for the Danish young men of the bourgeoisie, but then he realized, oh, it's actually the even lower layer of society, the farmers, who need this. And so we need folk Bildung, because the farmers, they're the ones who actually have this whole indigenous Danish culture as their frame of reference. So they carry the true Danish spirit. And so they need to pass that on to the bourgeoisie, because they just, I mean, for 200 years or 300 years, the official language of the Danish administration was German. And the kings imported German or Prussian noblemen, aristocrats, for his cabinet. But that changed in the late 1700s. But anyway, so Danish became a cultural force. And so this idea of there being a spirit and a people, and some sort of Danishness and Canadianness, I guess, in Canada, and Americanness in the US, that sense of there being a language and a heritage and a culture that is unique to one people doesn't mean that it doesn't correspond with other peoples. It just means that that particular people has a specific tradition that is connected to the flora and fauna and climate and history of that place. And that was so this pastor, his name is Grundtvig, he was writing about that, and he realized that the sort of indigenous knowledge among the peasants needed to define Danish culture, because that was the Danish spirit. And so they needed folk Bildung, because they couldn't just, keep telling their old tales and only know what they already knew. They needed the science. They needed, reading and writing skills, and they needed to understand how to run their farms better and stuff like that. And they needed to understand, what is a country? What's the history of this place? What is the actual history? What does the economy look like? They can't just know how to run their own farm. They need to know the context of what their farm is producing into. They need to know more than the local marketplace at the nearest town. They need to know about the rest of the country as well. And they need to know about Europe, and they need to know about the world. So that was his stroke of genius, to take it to the lowest part of society and lift it from the bottom. And that is really what made the huge difference. So that is the folk Bildung, and that is what became very successful in Denmark, and then was exported to Norway, Sweden, and Finland.
I love the idea of that circulation, where some kind of indigenous knowledge of the culture is circulating up from the folk representatives, but at the same time, that broader picture has to circulate down to them. So it's moving in two directions. Yep. I think what I want to ask, which is a little bit off that topic, is in terms of the mandala of your work, right? You've got a lot of different things included. You've got, individual development, and you've got these different cultural codes and developmental complexity and personal and collective issues, economics, technology, population scales, ritual, religion. There's a lot of stuff in there.
Yep.
What isn't in there next? What's the next thing for you to integrate? What's at the forefront of your thinking now?
How we popularize this, because we all need to have a relationship to this. We don't all need to understand everything, but the way we grew up knowing that a little bit about electricity. So you know enough about electricity that you don't put a fork into the socket in the wall. You don't drop the toaster in the bathtub, things like that. And the basics about the institutions in a liberal democracy and a modern nation state. You have an idea about what the UN does, and now we all hear about the WHO all the time. So if you paid attention in school, you know all of this, and you can read a newspaper or a news site and understand what it's talking about. But we only know that because we went to good schools. And if we fail ourselves and our children by I mean, our schools are even not teaching enough of this already. But if we cannot figure out how to integrate this kind of new thinking into the existing schools, but also getting adults interested in this, because we can't, wait 30 years until the next generation comes out of school and understands metamodernity or the personal development and what the potentials are for maturing with life experience and the ability to handle a globalized world with both deep local roots and local communities, nation states, continents that need to be able to work, nation states and individuals needing to collaborate at the continental level, and a globe that needs to function. So we need to also, be able to go in and out of complexity levels in social entities, and thereby different structures of governance and influence. And we can only do that if we understand what they're about and what their differences are. And maybe we should, revisit that idea of, okay, so you go to school for, 12 years, and then you either get a tertiary education or you start working, but you're not done with school. When you're 30 or 25 or 35, we expect everybody to go back to school for a year. Not because you can't provide for yourself and find a job, but simply because when you're 30, you're ready to learn something new. And you might actually be more motivated to study, for instance, history than you were when you were 17, because now you've been in a workplace and you know what horrible bosses are like. So you would understand, the Roman emperors from a different perspective, or you have, started a family of your own, and suddenly you understand why some of the political struggles look the way that they did, because now you have children, so you know the feeling of wanting to pass on a stable society and opportunities to your children. I mean, so maybe you just have to, revisit what you learned in the 4th grade, but from the perspective of being 30 years old. And so I think we need to change the culture in that direction. And I mean, I know that we have to, but it's also about creating a narrative and an understanding of, this is not because you're dumb. I mean, this is actually because you're smart, that you want to, keep learning about the world. And then we also need to set up the economy and society for it, where it's like, you're not going to have to sell your house and lose your job opportunities if you actually take this kind of sabbatical and improve your understanding of what goes on around you, and also some of your professional skills. But I mean, if you take a lot of people realize that they have to go back to college and, maybe study for 2 or 3 years and get a new degree. But in that is rarely also that Bildung part, the aesthetic part, the moral part, the historical part, the narrative, where you expand your understanding of what it means to be human, and where you discuss that with other people. And I mean, there's a lot of possibilities in these MOOCs, where you have 80,000 people in the same online course studying, quantum physics or bookkeeping or, macroeconomics. But if everybody just, studies for those specific things that they need in order to get a job, we're just going to get collectively dumber, because we're going to be more and more, narrow-minded and less capable of actually keeping conversations with people who have studied something other than we have, and who have different professions, who have different perspectives. So there is a crucial role for the established institutions of education to actually provide that broader perspective and bringing people together who do not share the same career dreams, and who can challenge each other, and where we can actually learn from different perspectives. So yes, I mean, we can do so much online, but we really have to be careful that we don't just, actually narrow our scopes.
Yeah, I've appreciated what you've said about the need to possibly re-envision the course of, a regular life, an ordinary life, where right now it seems to be oriented towards, raising a family, finding success, and then just compounding success and compounding,
Yeah, buying a
wealth.
house and being in debt for the rest of your life.
Right. And I
Yeah.
was thinking about the Hindu ashrama system, which is, you start out as the student, and then you become the householder, and then there's the retiree, and then there's the renunciate. And the retiree is not just go off on vacations, but in that stage in Hindu culture, that's the time when you begin to reorient towards wisdom. You begin to re-educate yourself. And so I felt like you were kind of articulating something like a metamodern version of that we need that time to pause and reorient towards wisdom and more inclusive vision in the second half of life, which I really like.
And I also think that is where you should, you need to give children a sense of, historical and aesthetic background. So they need to learn the historical and religious tradition of where they are. But we shouldn't expect 10-year-olds to understand it. So they need to have a good experience with the songs and the rituals and some of the stories. But you can't really demand faith of a child. But then when you're 30, you should, if you haven't been, a religious person during all those years, that may be when you're ready to revisit this and actually understand what it's about. Because this wasn't created by the 18-year-olds or 22-year-olds. It was created by the 50-year-olds and the 60-year-olds who had already struggled with life and who put that into something that people could gather around and into stories. And one of my absolute favorite books is Genesis. It's just, from a historical perspective, there's so many interesting details. It's like, oh, is that what they did in the Bronze Age? That is so weird. Or it's like, oh, wow, the women are getting, water for the camels. I never thought of that. It's like, there's so many details, and you can appreciate it in such a different way than when you're 10 years old and your only frame of reference is, the life that you have with your own family. And I grew up in a middle-class suburban setting outside of Copenhagen, and the first time that I heard the story about Abraham and Sarah, I placed that story at my grandparents' farm, which was built in 1932. And that was, those were the only sort of, people in the countryside that I could relate to. And so, the three angels were walking up to my grandparents' farm and talking to Abraham, who was like sitting outside in the yard in front of a farmhouse built in 1932. But that was the frame of reference I had. Later, I learned that it probably did look a little bit different in the Middle East 3,000 years ago, and I gradually understood the story in a completely different way. So we can do that when we're older, and it would be incredibly arrogant to think that there is nothing from 3,000 or 4,000 years ago or 50,000 years ago that would not resonate with what we all want to find, or that we struggle with in our own life. So yeah, I think there's a lot of richness and meaning that can be gained from this, even if you don't have any, even like a remote sense of there being anything super, whatever, beyond the shared physical reality, because there's a physical reality of the stories being written down and handed over generation after generation and being retold because they were meaningful in some way. And if we cut ourselves off from these many roots in who we are, and I really think of this as a very useful image. These are our roots into who we are. And if we cut the roots when we have all this turmoil going on and all these changes going on, it's so much easier to, lose your foothold and not be able to stand where you are and thrive. So the deeper the roots, the more the stronger you are in during these many changes that are going on, and the stronger you can actually have a moral compass telling you where to go and where absolutely not to go.
The recurring theme of age is very interesting in this conversation. And I was just imagining, the famous William Golding novel, Lord of the Flies, about a crash where pre-adolescent kids have to design a society on their own. And it would be fascinating to rewrite that novel and have a bunch of 60-year-olds have to redesign society on their own.
Yeah.
I was thinking about how it takes time to be able to not only gain human experience, but also to get interest in things that are outside of your own immediate embedding, right? When you're young, the world around you is just so immediate that it takes a while for you to start to see the past.
Yeah.
That pattern of moving forward to seeing the past intrigues me a lot. Yesterday, I was moderating this discussion between Greg Henriquez and Steve McIntosh, and Greg was talking about the indigenous, but Steve was saying, yes, but it's postmodern consciousness that makes us interested in the indigenous. And there's a sense in which the further we go forward, the more we learn about the past, like you were talking about earlier on, the potential that there are submerged really early civilizations, which we're starting to see some evidence of. But that's a thing that where we go forward in time, we gain more clarity on what there was in the past, even more than people who were our predecessors knew.
Yep.
And that makes me think about, I'm on a tangent here, but it makes me think about patterns of time, and it makes me curious about what the role of time is in your thinking, and what sort of, what impression of time is necessary in order to string together and organize all these different domains of thought into something that's harmonized.
I come from a very linear concept of time, and I totally admit that. And I think that we could be, this is a product of, it actually goes back to Genesis. In the beginning. And then Christianity sort of adds an end to that story. So far it hasn't arrived, and I'm pretty happy about that. But there's this is a narrative that is very linear. And we also have the concept of the individual. And the individual in our culture is, given birth, and then we die. And it's a linear thing. It's like beginning, end, out of the story. But indigenous cultures have a circular concept of time, and things repeat themselves, and you can see that in nature year after year, and you can see that in the moon, and you can see it in the day and the sun. And so there's this concept of circularity and repetition, and some people have put these together, and so in the spiral of linear and then the circular. So there are many ways of interpreting this and understanding time, and I think we need all of them, but they're not equally useful in the same situations. And so I think the older I get, the more circular my understanding of life becomes. Maybe because I'm approaching the end of that line. Getting closer and closer, probably some years out into the future. But I've also seen more stuff repeat itself. And so that is a part of life experience. And so it does make a lot of sense the older you get. And you, I don't have children, but if you do, and then at some point you have grandchildren, and if you live long enough, you have great-grandchildren. And so that's a circularity. And you see, not only your kids repeating your mistakes, their kids are repeating their mistakes and your mistakes. And so you see all these repetitions. And once you start seeing them from the outside, you can also start seeing yourself from the outside. And then you see your own, repetitions of things. So yeah, the longer time you've been in this world, the more perspective you gain on it. And until we had the linear concept of time, it was also really hard to handle changes. And so there is no narrative of the world changing, but in our civilization, everything has to be new. You have to change everything all the time, and there has to be progress to the point where you're just ruining all the good, or many of the good results that we've actually created. And we are beginning to create a lot of changes that are not progress anymore by any standard, because they are ruining nature and our chance of survival. That's a really bad thing. That's my personal opinion. So yes, I mean, the understanding of time is defined by culture and experience, and I think that I mean, life also becomes much richer once you have these this perspective on it. And then there's the whole, quantum physics and where physics is taking the understanding of time, and I'm not, updated on that, but there are some weird stuff going on that's just going in all kinds of directions. So quantum time, I'm not going to say anything about that.
Well, speaking of time, we usually keep these to about an hour and a half, so I think we're about at our time right now. But I really enjoyed the conversation with you, and I wanted to know if there's anything that feels unsaid, anything else that you'd like to bring up or bring in.
This has been a great pleasure. I really enjoyed it, and I'm very happy that you brought both the Bildung Rose and Metamodernity into this, because I think that both understandings are great helpers to illustrate what our societies and our opportunities, possibilities, and limitations are, and they're great ways of starting conversations and being more explicit about what are good ideas and what are bad ideas, and what is meaningful and what is not meaningful, and how do we help ourselves that this is not just a conversation among people like us who spend so much time thinking about this, but how do we get it disseminated throughout our societies so that we have more understanding of the complexity of the world that we're in, and so that we can actually have long-term, wiser political decisions in the political sphere, at the national level, local level, continental and global level, but also in other institutions or organizations where people make decisions on behalf of lots of people and the environment. So so I really enjoyed this, so thank you.
That's a great summary statement, and I don't want to ruin it, but I do want to ask, are there any really funny, really hip Danish sitcoms we should be watching?
I don't know. And they would be in Danish. There's some really cool Norwegian ones, and one of them was called Lillehammer. I think that's about 10 years ago by now. And then there was a Norwegian sitcom. It was not a sitcom, it was a youth series called Skam, which is about 5 or 6 years old now, I think, but was groundbreaking in the way that it integrated. It took place at a high school in Oslo, and I think some of the students more or less played themselves. I haven't really watched it, so I don't know it that well, but I've watched a couple of episodes just to check it out. And they were really, they integrated all the messages that they have on their cell phones in the screen, so that their messaging to each other is part of the narrative and the story. And so it had many layers, and it was a hit in Norway. And for years, Danish and Swedish and Norwegian youth have said, nah, the other Nordic language is too hard to learn, and we just want to speak English to one another. But then this TV series came, and suddenly youth in both Denmark and Sweden were like, hey, we suddenly understand Norwegian. So yes, that's another thing that you can do with art. Once it's interesting enough, people will learn the language. And we've all done that with the English language anyway. So yeah. We need cultural exchange, and look up Skam, Skam, shame. It's probably being produced in the US by now, or maybe even have had a US twin. I don't know.
Terrific. Thanks very much. It's been a real lovely thing to get to see you, and I'm very happy that you joined us.
Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yes, really enjoyed it. Thanks very much. Take care.